Hey, what's up YouTube? So my computer is not currently functioning, so I'm recording this on my phone. I'm not sure when I'm going to get the opportunity to upload this, but I thought I would take this opportunity to talk a little bit about my approach to epistemology. A lot of people have asked me to clarify my views here. So the slogan for my position is pretty straightforward. In my view, there is no justification. No beliefs have justification, but there is nothing irrational about believing without justification. First point of clarification is I make a distinction between justification and reasons. Clearly, people have all sorts of reasons why they believe things. And when I'm talking about reasons in this context, I mean answers to why questions. So I can ask somebody, why they believe what they do, and they can give me an answer. And then I'm going to say, okay, well, that counts as a reason for that belief. And that can be anything, right? In principle, that could be anything at all. But we only have justification for our beliefs if our reasons are good reasons, or the right reasons, or rationally compelling reasons, or something like that, right? Like, the idea is supposed to be that some reasons for belief are privileged in some way. So, for example, I might claim that the moon is edible. And if you ask me why I believe that, I say, well, because the moon is made of cheese, or, because I find it comforting to think of lots of little mice running around eating the moon. Okay, well, I've given reasons why I believe that the moon is edible, but most people wouldn't take those reasons to provide justification, because it's crazy to say that the moon is made of cheese. It's just silly, So, so the position that I hold is there just is no justification. No beliefs ever actually have justification. So ultimately, there are simply various reasons. There's all sorts of reasons why people believe things. Some of these reasons I like, some I dislike. Some of them I approve of, some I disapprove of, and that's all. That's all there is to it. Okay, why do I hold this sort of position? Well, obviously I can't give you a justification for that, because I don't think there is any justification. Of course, by my lights, that doesn't matter because there's nothing irrational about holding beliefs without justification. But I can give you some reasons. I think that there's a few different things, but I suppose the main sort of two motivations for this sort of view. First of all, I'm inclined to just reject normativity across the board. So, of course, I've uploaded videos before where I talk about this in the context of moral normativity. I don't think there are any objective moral values. I don't think there's anything, I don't think there are any, stance-independent moral facts. There's nothing that you sort of morally ought or ought not to do, at least objectively. And again, I've talked about that in previous videos. But I reject like just all normativity. I find normativity in general to be just as mysterious as moral normativity. So in the same way that I would say there's no sort of good and bad actions, similarly, it's just as puzzling to me to talk about good and bad reasons. It's just as puzzling to me to talk about what you ought or ought not to do as it is to talk about what you ought or ought not to believe. Again, at least if we're there can be things that I like and dislike, and there are things that other people like and dislike. It may well be the case that I happen to approve of things like consistency and simplicity. And of course, if you happen to approve of consistency and simplicity, if you want to achieve consistency and simplicity in your beliefs, then there are certain sets of beliefs that are going to be better suited to that than others. Again, in the same sort of way, when it comes to your actions, if you happen to care about promoting pleasure, for instance, well, there's going to be particular actions that are better suited to promoting pleasure than others. But so one point here is I don't find epistemic normativity, or the idea of epistemic norms, to be on any better footing than the idea of like moral norms, moral normativity. So that's one motivation. And then the second motivation, I think probably the more important one, is just reflection on various skeptical arguments. So things like the problem of the criterion, Hume's skeptical attack on reason. I have reflected on these arguments, and as a result of that, I find that my own beliefs sort of, my mind, as it were, just runs into this kind of fog. I lose even the feeling that I have justification. So take, for instance, Hume's argument. I have a video on Hume's argument against reason. It's not, I don't know if it's exactly an argument against reason, but it's an argument to the effect that, reason leads to a kind of radical skepticism. I have a video on this, I'll link that in the comments. The way that Hume's argument works is he says, okay, consider any sort of belief that you have, right? So maybe I believe that the sun is the barycenter of the solar system. Okay, so the first thing to note is that this isn't something that I believe with absolute certainty. I recognize that I could be wrong about this. So really I'm making some sort of probability judgment. I'm saying, I'm sort of 95%, maybe even more than 95%, maybe I'm like 99% sure that the sun is the barycenter of the solar system. But then, in order to have that confidence, I'm going to have to make an assessment of my own reliability at forming beliefs of that type. So, how reliable am I at forming beliefs about, the nature of the solar system? And, when I reflect on my own reliability, one thing I will notice is that, okay, well, there are conditions where sometimes I'm less reliable. So, I recognize that if I'm drunk, or if I'm stressed, or if I'm overcome with joy or whatever, then maybe I'm not going to be so reliable in my belief formation. That's going to sort of interfere with my ability to form beliefs. So I have to I have to determine like the contexts in which I'm more or less reliable in general at forming beliefs, and then I have to think about specific subject matters, because I'm going to be more reliable about some subject matters than others. So when I then think about this belief that the sun is the barycenter of the solar system, I ask, well, how reliable am I at forming beliefs about, say, the sun? And this is going to introduce sort of further uncertainty. Maybe I'm because I'm not perfectly reliable at that. But then I've made another sort of judgment, right? When I say that I have such and such degree of reliability at forming beliefs about the nature of the sun, well, that is itself a judgment, and I now need to ask how reliable I'm going to be at forming that judgment, and then that's going to introduce further uncertainty. And so what you end up with is this sort of stack of beliefs, or this stack of judgments, where each one introduces further uncertainty that like transmits down the chain to that initial judgment that the sun is the barycenter of the solar system. That's basically Hume's argument. Again, if that wasn't clear, I have a video on it, which hopefully will make it a bit more clear. But the result of this, but the thing is, like, look, I've reflected on this. I have done the task that Hume encourages us to do. I've sort of attempted to do this like vertical assessment of my beliefs, and as I mentioned, the result is that my mind very quickly runs into a fog. I just lose any sense at all of having justification, of there like actually being, so I think that the point is that the result of reflecting on these sorts of arguments is I get this really strong feeling that in principle, like any set of beliefs is just going to be based on completely arbitrary assumptions. and a whole bunch of arbitrary assumptions as well. Like it's not just one or two arbitrary assumptions. It's not just like, well, we take this sort of a couple of axioms that seem self-evident, and then we can kind of build up the rest of our knowledge on them. No, it's just this like flood of completely arbitrary assumptions, and that just seems to be all we're left with. So the result of this is I just think, okay, well, looks like we have no justification then. So yeah, I guess it's a product of like my kind of global rejection of normativity, and then reflecting on some of these classic skeptical arguments. It leads me to this sense that there's just no justification. But the thing is that I want to continue holding beliefs, and I just don't see what the problem with that is supposed to be. I mean, certainly if you say that there's no justification, you're not going to be able to say that, presumably you're not going to say that you can give a justification for why it would be bad or wrong to continue holding beliefs without justification. So my attitude is, seems perfectly fine for me to carry on holding beliefs without justification. So yeah, that's what I'm going to carry on doing. Okay. So of course, what I've just done here is I guess I've given you the reasons why I hold the sort of view I do. Of course, these reasons, I mean, I'm not presenting them as like, arguments that are supposed to be rationally compelling to everybody. What I've done really is just give a sort of description of my own psychological tendencies. Like I was exposed to certain types of arguments, and then I formed certain views. That's all there is to it. It's kind of similar to saying like, I was hit on the head with a stick, and then I formed certain views. It's purely descriptive. I am absolutely not claiming that like these arguments are supposed to be rationally compelling. And of course, I mean, as it happens, very few people do find these arguments compelling. Most people think that the sort of position I hold is totally absurd. Okay, that's fine, right? By my own lights. So that's my general epistemology. But this sort of thing does raise a question, which is, well, if this is your sort of view, what is the point of doing philosophy? Because I think that one of the traditional ways of one of the traditional things that philosophy is supposed to do is, philosophers are in the business of like assessing arguments, right? Like philosophers are in the business of figuring out what count as good and bad reasons. And of course, philosophers are operating at the most general level there. So, I mean, of course, if you are like a chemist, say, then, maybe there's some sense in which you might say that like chemistry is like focused on what count as sort of good and bad reasons for holding particular views with respect to chemistry. I don't know, maybe that makes sense. But certainly if we're talking about philosophy, philosophers are interested in like reasons in the most sort of general, broad sense. Like what are good arguments? What are compelling arguments, or like rationally compelling arguments? What are the good reasons? What are the right reasons? Philosophers are in the business of telling us what we ought and ought not to believe. And obviously on the view that I hold, I mean, I'm just not going to be able to do that. So what am I doing when I do philosophy? What is the point? I actually think that, so here's how I approach philosophy, or here's a few different ways that I am kind of inclined to approach philosophy. So one thing that I think philosophy could be good for is just exploring different ideas, right? Like we can look at different views, different theories. We can expose ourselves to ideas that we wouldn't otherwise have been exposed to. We can think about the conceptual connections between different views and theories. We can look at the sort of logical structure of different theories and so on. So one of the things that philosophers can do is sort of map out this kind of conceptual space. Another thing that philosophy can be good for, I think, is resisting resisting dogmatic attitudes. I mean, philosophy isn't always good at this. I think there's plenty of philosophers who seem to be very keen on promoting dogmatic attitudes. But if you are more, if you're more inclined to the sort of attitude that I have, if you're more sympathetic to various forms of skepticism and so on, then I think that it seems as though philosophy could play the role of resisting sort of dogmatism. And the way that it would do this is, so the thought is, well, okay, maybe philosophy isn't going to come up with justification or with rationally compelling arguments or anything like that, but what I can do is I can say things which, from the point of view of other people, might count as, by their lights, the things that I say might count as justifying a more open sort of attitude. So in other words, I don't have to take it, when I give an argument for something, I don't have to consider that argument to provide a good reason for anything. It's enough if my opponent takes the argument to provide a good reason for something. And, philosophers, when they give sort of skeptical arguments, when they try to challenge convention and the accepted worldview, they may well provide arguments that are compelling to people who hold those conventional views. So I suppose then, then of course the other thing philosophy could be good at is just rhetoric, right? Like there is this process of persuading other people, and philosophers may be good at that. But so I think that, it seems to me that I can basically go on and I can sort of continue to do exactly what it is that philosophers have traditionally done. Right? I can carry on giving arguments for things. It maybe a sort of useful comparison here would be like art history, and I'm not sure if this is, this might be a bit of a simplification, but like here's a sort of toy model of art history, right? So there was a time when artists were focused on realist representation. Like they wanted to use art to kind of mirror the world, right? Like so they would create pictures that were supposed to represent objects out there in the world, and they were trying to capture the way those objects really were. Again, I mean, I know this is a simplification, but like I'm just illustrating a point here. Okay, so there was this sort of time when artists were working in a realist style. They were doing a particular style of art because it was like that was what art was supposed to be. Then, of course, along comes all of these like developments in art, like Cubism and Dadaism and abstract expressionism, and suddenly the idea that the point of art is to mirror the world just completely goes out the window. Like art can just be anything, anything goes, right? And so suddenly, maybe we might say that actually the very notion of realist representation, of there being some way of representing an art that is realist, maybe that very notion is incoherent, or even if there is a coherent way of understanding what realist representation could be, well, there's just no requirement to do that. Okay, fine. But the point is that if it's the case that just anything goes, right? Like once you're at the point where you have given up all of the rules, well, one of the things that you can do is just continue creating art in the realist style. You can continue doing what those earlier artists did, but you will just sort of conceive of it a bit differently, right? Like you can continue producing the same stuff, but maybe you won't think of it as providing a realist representation of anything, or maybe you will think of it as realist representation, but you won't think of it as being like that's the sort of requirement, like that's the way art ought to be. Well, I think it's it can be the same with philosophical argument, right? Like I can just carry on doing exactly what traditional philosophers have done. I can continue providing arguments in the same sort of way. I I don't have to think of them as providing good reasons or the right reasons or anything like that. Yeah, I guess, so yeah, I mean, I guess that's the idea, right? Like, like if anything goes, then traditional philosophy goes as well. That's perfectly fine as well. So I guess that's all I had to say, and well, I hope to be speaking to you again soon. Hopefully, when with a, I mean, this was just sort of a bit off the top of my head. My computer, as I say, is not working. I'm hoping to get that fixed pretty soon. It's a bit frustrating not having that. But yeah, I'm gonna stop this video here and see you in the next video.